Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal exciting details on Wednesday, July 30th, 2025. First, Michael stood at the edge of a decision that would not only redefine his role as a father but also challenge the very boundaries of forgiveness. For weeks, he had tried to bury the hurt, to rationalize the betrayal he felt when Willow walked away from their marriage and into Drew's arms. That betrayal had shattered the family they had built, a life carefully stitched together through years of pain, healing, and hope. Watching her standing beside Drew in that church, only to crumble when the truth about Drew and Nina's relationship was exposed, reignited wounds he thought had long since scarred over. Yet beneath his fury, there was an ache he couldn't ignore. The sight of Willow's silent suffering as she realized that Drew had manipulated her trust, much like she had once manipulated Michael's. Even in his anger, Michael had not been blind to Willow's pain. Her world had unraveled in front of the entire town, her dignity left in ruins as she walked away from a man she thought would help her reclaim her children. Michael knew all too well what it meant to be deceived by someone you trusted, and although he had no desire to absolve Willow of her actions, he could see the desperation in her eyes. The way she clutched a crumpled photograph of Wiley, the way she stood outside the gate of the Corinthos estate in the rain for hours without knocking, it all whispered of a woman who had lost more than just a relationship. She had lost her children, and in that, Michael saw not a traitor, but a mother slowly breaking apart. Wiley, too, had begun to feel the absence. Michael heard it in the quiet moments, when Wiley asked why Mommy stopped reading bedtime stories, or when he left drawings on the windowsill, hoping Willow might see them. Amelia, still too young to speak clearly, often reached out to the empty space beside her crib, murmuring sounds that Michael believed were her way of calling for Willow. Every reminder was a needle under Michael's skin, each one poking holes in the armor he had built around his heart. His mother Carly advised caution. Dante encouraged boundaries. But nothing anyone said could silence the growing awareness that the pain Willow carried mirrored his own in ways he no longer wished to admit. Eventually, Michael made the decision alone, not as a son, not as a betrayed lover, but as a father. He watched Willow from afar one afternoon as she stood across the street from the park, her hand pressed against the iron fence as she watched Wiley play. Her face lit up just once, fleetingly, when Wiley laughed. That was the moment everything shifted. Michael realized that holding on to bitterness was no longer a strength but a burden. The choice to keep Willow away from the children was rooted not in justice but in vengeance, and vengeance, he understood, would only poison what little peace they had left. He invited her quietly, without announcement or confrontation, allowing her to spend time with the children under his supervision. Willow didn't cry when she saw them, she knelt silently, holding out her arms as Wiley ran into them, his small hands gripping her tightly. Amelia nestled into her shoulder, cooing softly. Michael stood back, unmoving, watching as the woman who once betrayed him became something softer, quieter, and more honest. There were no apologies exchanged, no promises made. Just a moment of silent understanding between two parents who had been through a war and still carried the scars. The atmosphere in the house began to shift. Wiley's laughter grew more frequent. Amelia slept more soundly. Even Michael found that the sharp edges in his own chest had dulled somewhat. Willow never overstepped, she never asked for more than what was given. She simply showed up, brought books, and told stories, content with whatever time Michael allowed her. And in those small, quiet hours, Michael began to see the woman she had once been, before the deception, before Drew, before everything collapsed. She was not perfect, but neither was he, and in recognizing her flaws, he was forced to confront his own. While Michael hadn't forgiven Willow, not yet. He had come to accept that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. Letting her see the children wasn't a concession of defeat, but an act of grace, one that allowed his children to experience both of their parents without being burdened by adult bitterness. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Michael knew that for once, he had chosen not out of pride, but out of love, and in that, perhaps, he had taken the first step toward healing not just for himself, but for all of them. Second, after the whirlwind of chaos that unfolded over the past several days, Trina found herself consumed by guilt and heartbreak. She had always prided herself on being loyal, careful, and fiercely protective of her family. But one moment of misplaced trust had brought everything crashing down. Believing that Kai, her boyfriend, was someone she could confide in without consequence, she had shared the intricate details of Curtis's confidential plans. At the time, it felt like an innocent act of transparency within a relationship. In hindsight, it was a devastating mistake. Kai had gone behind her back and exposed everything to Drew, triggering a chain reaction that not only humiliated Curtis but also publicly shattered Willow's wedding and nearly destroyed Trina's family. Curtis and Portia had worked hard to rebuild the fragile unity of their family, and now it lay fractured once more, this time because of Trina. She had been blind to the signs: Kai's opportunistic tendencies, his hunger for influence, his subtle manipulation of her emotions. When the truth came out and Drew used the information against Curtis, the backlash was immediate and brutal. Willow, blindsided by Curtis's revelation just moments before her vows, fled the ceremony in tears, leaving everyone stunned. Curtis had become the scapegoat, but he knew too well where the leak originated. Trina had betrayed his trust, and that knowledge had left him devastated, not just as a father, but as a man who had hoped his daughter understood the importance of loyalty and discretion. Kai's betrayal was the final nail in the coffin for their relationship. Trina didn't hesitate to walk away from him after everything unraveled. She realized that his charm had masked a deep selfishness, one that cared more about using her connection than protecting it. Still, breaking up with him did not undo the pain she caused. Every time she looked at her parents, especially at Curtis, the weight of her actions became unbearable. She felt like an outsider in her own home, her silence heavy with shame. Even though no one explicitly blamed her out loud, the unspoken tension was louder than words. Portia tried to remain composed, but the disappointment in her eyes was clear. Curtis, meanwhile, kept his distance, choosing silence over confrontation, a reaction that hurt Trina more than if he had yelled. Eventually, Trina knew she had to confront her mistake head-on. One evening, unable to bear the distance any longer, she approached her father, her heart pounding and hands trembling. She didn't try to explain or make excuses. Instead, she simply said she was sorry. Sorry for trusting the wrong person. Sorry for not protecting the sanctity of the plan. Sorry for making things worse for everyone she loved. Her voice cracked as she admitted that she had never imagined Kai would use her like that, and that her misjudgment had hurt the people she cared for most. Curtis listened quietly, his face unreadable. When she finished, the silence hung between them for a moment, heavy and uncertain, until he finally stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. Curtis's gesture didn't erase the pain, but it softened the distance. In that quiet, fatherly touch, Trina felt the first sign that forgiveness was possible. They didn't need to speak much more after that. The embrace they shared said everything that words could not: pain, regret, understanding, and a desire to heal. Portia, who had been listening nearby, walked over and joined them, her expression warmer, more hopeful than it had been in days. For the first time since everything fell apart, Trina felt the beginnings of reconciliation. She didn't expect immediate absolution, but the fact that her parents were willing to try meant everything. She had learned a painful lesson about loyalty, betrayal, and the delicate balance of trust, and she vowed never to let herself make that mistake again. As the days passed, the household began to mend, slowly but steadily. Curtis began talking to Trina more, sharing quiet observations or asking about her day, simple actions that slowly rebuilt their bond. Portia cooked family meals again, and Trina made an effort to be present, engaged, and open. The wounds hadn't disappeared, but they had begun to close, no longer festering in silence. Trina spent more time at home, working on rebuilding that sense of safety and connection. She no longer needed to prove herself through words, her actions spoke volumes. She helped without being asked, listened without judgment, and offered small moments of affection that she had taken for granted before. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had transformed. What was once a home strained by betrayal was now a space cautiously filled with hope. Curtis still bore the scars of what had happened, but when he looked at Trina, he no longer saw the daughter who had let him down, he saw the daughter who had fought to make it right. Trina knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but she was ready for the work. And for the first time since the disaster with Kai and the unraveling of Curtis's plans, she felt that maybe, just maybe, her family would come out of this stronger than before. Third, in the days following the catastrophic wedding, a new clarity began to take root within Willow. The veil had been lifted, and what she once believed to be a partnership built on hope and strategy had revealed itself to be a carefully constructed illusion orchestrated by Drew. His assurances, his tender words, and the promise of a reunited family were nothing more than tools of manipulation. Willow, now humiliated and emotionally fractured, recognized how deeply she had been played. But instead of collapsing beneath the weight of betrayal, she made a choice, to fight back. No longer content to be a passive figure in someone else's narrative, she sought out Rick Lansing, a man known for his tactical mind and ruthless efficiency. She didn't come to him in tears or begging for help, she came as a woman ready to wage war for the only thing that still mattered, her children. Rick had already prepared for her arrival with precision. He had followed the unraveling of her engagement to Drew with keen interest, knowing that this storm would eventually bring opportunity. As Willow stepped into his office, composed but clearly hollowed out by pain, Rick offered the kind of welcome reserved for clients who were both vulnerable and valuable. He listened as she outlined the emotional manipulation, the rushed wedding, and the threats, veiled or not, that Drew used to convince her that being with him was the only way to restore custody of Wiley and Amelia. Rick took notes, asked sharp questions, and immediately began sketching out a legal offensive designed to fracture Drew's influence piece by piece. For Rick, this wasn't just about the law, it was about power dynamics, image, and the careful destruction of Drew's carefully curated persona. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had opened her front door to find Willow standing there, a storm in her eyes but a quiet plea in her posture. She welcomed Willow without hesitation, guiding her into the warm, familiar living room where emotional refuge had been offered to many before. Willow didn't know what she needed, only that she couldn't sit in silence alone any longer. As the chaos of her life rang in her ears like distant thunder, she allowed herself to speak, haltingly at first, and then in waves. Elizabeth listened, not with judgment or pity, but with understanding. She had seen betrayal before. She knew what it was to love someone and then realize they had built a reality on lies. She offered Willow no quick fixes, only the space to unravel and then slowly stitch herself back together. Elizabeth's voice was calm and grounding as she reassured Willow that what mattered now was how she chose to move forward. Drew had used manipulation as a weapon, but Willow had the power to reclaim her agency. There would be time for legal action, for public confrontation, for battles in courtrooms and behind closed doors. But in that moment, what Willow needed most was to breathe, to center herself, and to remember that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered in the stillness, reminding her that she was still a mother, still worthy, still capable of rising from the wreckage. Elizabeth, always the quiet anchor in moments of chaos, reminded her that calmness was not weakness but a strategy. Rick's plan grew more elaborate with each meeting. He would gather financial records, unearth Drew's hidden dealings, question the legality of the rushed engagement, and file for immediate modifications to the custody arrangement. He also advised Willow to remain composed, to let Drew make the next public misstep while they moved quietly in the background. The court system favored structure and reason, not emotional outbursts. And Rick knew how to play that game better than most. He instructed Willow to begin documenting everything, texts, calls, promises broken, and to be ready for a legal confrontation that might test her limits. But with Rick guiding the attack and Elizabeth tending to the wounds, Willow finally began to feel like she wasn't alone. Each night, Willow would return from Rick's office drained but focused. She'd stop by Elizabeth's home, not always to talk, sometimes just to sit in silence, letting the soft hum of life around her offer brief moments of peace. The children played in the background, and Elizabeth moved through the house with the ease of someone who had rebuilt herself many times. Willow found comfort in that, a model of quiet resilience. The emotional storm within her still surged, but it no longer threatened to drown her. Instead, it became fuel. She had clarity now, and with it, the resolve to act not from vengeance but from protection, of herself, of Wiley, and of Amelia. Willow no longer needed to scream to be heard. Her silence became her power, her actions her voice. She moved with purpose, listened more than she spoke, and kept her circle tight. Drew, still confident in his control over the narrative, was unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his line of sight. He would soon learn that the woman he tried to break had instead become the one who would dismantle everything he built. Not with public humiliation, but with precision, timing, and the law on her side. And as Willow prepared for the next chapter of her fight, supported by Rick's strategy and Elizabeth's quiet strength, she knew one thing with certainty: this time, she wouldn't lose. Finally, Nina had always been underestimated. Dismissed as emotional, erratic, or too entangled in the past to truly be a threat. But beneath her composed exterior was a woman forged in fire, shaped by years of betrayal, heartbreak, and the long, painful journey of reclaiming her identity. Now, with the wedding between Willow and Drew officially destroyed, Nina saw a door swing open, a chance to not only celebrate her daughter's escape from a dangerous union but also ensure that Drew paid the full price for his deception. She masked her satisfaction behind soft smiles and calm words, but inside, she was calculating every move with ruthless precision. She knew this wasn't just about vindication, it was about protecting Willow from further pain, and ensuring Drew's manipulations would never again find fertile ground. While Willow began rebuilding her life in the emotional shelter of Elizabeth's home and the legal strategy offered by Rick, Nina moved quietly through the shadows. She didn't need applause or recognition, she needed results. She began by tapping into the networks she had quietly cultivated over the years: journalists, legal insiders, and board members who owed her favors. Piece by piece, she gathered the ammunition that would unravel Drew's fragile empire. Financial inconsistencies, past cover-ups, and the carefully concealed details of his manipulations were collected and stored like chess pieces waiting to be played. Nina had no intention of confronting him directly. Instead, she preferred to watch from a distance as the walls around him began to crumble, each one chipped away by a secret she had unearthed and quietly unleashed into the right hands. Drew, once so confident in his ability to control perception and manipulate truth, found himself blindsided by the sudden cascade of disasters. Contracts dissolved without explanation. Investors withdrew their support. A private audit was launched into one of his companies, followed by a leaked email that hinted at ethical breaches. Drew scrambled for control, but it slipped through his fingers like sand. He began to suspect sabotage but couldn't identify the source. What haunted him most was the eerie precision with which everything collapsed, as if someone knew his weaknesses better than he did. Someone who had once trusted him. Someone who had bided her time. That realization, slow and agonizing, pointed in only one direction: Nina. For Nina, the satisfaction didn't come from watching Drew suffer. It came from the knowledge that she had finally reclaimed the power he once tried to strip from her. She had believed him, allowed him into her family, and watched him ensnare her daughter with charm and manipulation. He had played the role of protector while weaving a web of lies that almost cost Willow her children and her dignity. Nina could not forgive that, not as a woman, and certainly not as a mother. So she struck back in the only way that truly mattered, by dismantling everything Drew valued while leaving him with nothing but the weight of his own shame. It was a quiet, deliberate takedown, executed not out of vengeance but from a place of maternal reckoning. Drew began to unravel as reality closed in. He tried reaching out to Willow, desperate to salvage his version of events, but she refused to answer. Rick blocked his legal maneuvers, Elizabeth offered no sympathy, and Nina remained silent, watching from a distance as he descended into desperation. The more he fought to maintain control, the more obvious it became that his allies had abandoned him. He stood alone, accused but not yet tried, shunned but not yet destroyed. And that limbo was Nina's design, to let him twist, not knowing where the next blow would come from or when it would land. He knew now what it felt like to be powerless, to be outmaneuvered by someone he had once dismissed as irrelevant. Willow, though unaware of the full extent of Nina's machinations, began to sense a shift. Drew's name disappeared from the headlines. His once steady presence faded from public events. Word spread of his companies falling under review, of contracts vanishing, and of allies quietly severing ties. It was as though he had simply begun to vanish, consumed by a force he couldn't fight. Willow didn't need to ask questions. She simply looked at her mother and saw the calm resolve of a woman who had protected her daughter in the only way she could. And though no words were exchanged, the message was clear: Drew was no longer a threat, because Nina had made sure of it. In the end, Nina didn't celebrate.